Welcome to the 170th edition of Europe Calling, a little anniversary. My name is Maximilian Fries. I'm the managing director of Europe Calling. And you can see here already our 5 great guests coming from all over Europe, twice Berlin, once from Brussels, once from Düsseldorf, Vienna, and San Sebastian as well. So this is a real, true European panel today. And before we start, and I'm going to introduce the guests a bit further, some organizational announcements. We will be speaking German and English today, and you can choose the channel in your control bar. I will give this information also through in the chat. And just a little overview from my side so that you know what you can expect from us today. We will start with Leonore Gewessler, and all the participants will have the possibility to give a presentation, and we do a bit an unusual take today. First, the politicians have the floor, and then the scientists. We usually do the other way around. And afterwards, we will have time for Q&A, for questions. And as usual, you can ask your questions. And what is really important, we have over 1,200 registrations. You can put your question in and you can tell us what you think of the other questions. So you can rate the other questions. If you ask your question, please add a name. Doesn't have to be your personal name, but it is much better than anonymous user. And Europe Calling will be recorded and it will be available on YouTube and as a podcast afterwards. Please keep this in mind when you ask questions. And now let's get started. And first of all, I would like to say something why we are doing this here today. Just before I received quite a number of information questions. There are a lot of other topics of importance, and that is true if we think of the geopolitical situation. But social injustice, this is exactly the breeding ground for the social division that is currently really threatening us. We see that on the streets, we see it in the social media, and therefore it is always important to talk about social justice. And therefore it is so important to do that here today. And I'm really happy that the guests we have here today took the time to come and join. And if I say guests, then I would like to start with Leonore Gewessler. She is federal minister, well, basically for the Green Deal, one could say, for climate action, environment, energy, mobility, innovation, and technology. And she's known for many things, for night chats especially, and for the climate bonus. And everybody here in Germany is envious because this doesn't really work well in Germany here. And therefore, I'm particularly happy that she joins us here today and that she will start our Europe Calling session. And we're looking forward to your presentation. You have the floor. Yes, thank you very much indeed for your very warm welcome. It was important to me that we have the opportunity to talk here together today and to do climate justice, just transition, a climate policy for many. This is basically close to my heart, and this is a core question for the Green Party and for us in the government. Thank you very much. I would like to explain a little bit what we are doing concretely in Austria and how we implement that. But at the beginning, nevertheless, to give you the big picture, I would like to say we had negotiations for the government program, and it was very clear. Climate neutrality for 2040 in Austria was important, and this is exactly what we fought for. We thought of measures, for example, the CO2 price, and you can already see this one measures show that the costs of climate detrimental behavior gets a cost factor. And if that can be planned and is prospective and it is increased, but these costs affect people in different ways in their lives. And what we see is that those who still need fossil infrastructures are affected in a different way. But we see that those who do not have a high income are affected differently from a CO2 pricing. And those, on the other hand, have a much lower CO2 emission than the rich households. Just as one example shows why distribution questions and equality have to play a role in our policy, and they are really a guide, a guardrail, and we must make sure that this transformation is a fair one that does not leave anyone behind. We have to make sure that climate neutrality for Austria and Europe is not only a chance for us, that we really use this chance, make use of this chance in a fair way. And these are maybe stereotypes, you might say, but it is even more important that we really fill that with life and we turn that into proper politics, and that they don't remain headlines, but on the contrary, that we bring them to life in concrete projects. And while I say that, I'm very well aware that we must always keep in mind social equality, but not all these social injustice problems can be solved via the climate policy. This is a task for many different parts of politics. And at the moment, we are really at a turning point, and it is necessary to give innovative ideas a breakthrough, not only as far as technology is concerned, but together in our social change. We have to redefine how our well-being will be and what we will do. How can we give equality for everybody? And how can different measures work? And this is something I would like to explain with three examples. Three examples we have put into place in Austria already for 3 years. First of all, the so-called climate ticket, the climate ticket, and the political idea behind the introduction of this climate ticket was that really everyone in Austria should be able to afford mobility. It has to be the most affordable mobility we can offer. And why is this important? Also, from a social point of view, we know those who have lower revenues, do not fly as much, do not have as many cars, have a different mobility. For all public transports, we wanted to offer a flat rate ticket, €3 a day, 1,095 euros per year. And well, for a federally structured country like Austria, that was really a revolution. And it was in federal politic programs for years, but was not put into practice. But we did it, we the Green Party, mobility at a price that is much cheaper than motorized private transport. There's yet another discount for young people, so they can afford the ticket as well. And after 2 years, we can really be proud of that result. The number of users of this nationwide ticket exceeds our forecast by more than double. 1,095 euros a year. So this applies to all the public transport modes, trains, buses, trams, you name it, for €3 a day. This was really used by 50% more than we thought, and we can really say one Austrian in 7 now has a subscription for this ticket we offer, and this is great. And if we can prove that it is not a question of money, it is also influencing the immobility, because those using this climate ticket say they, even though they have a car, they use public transport more often. And the second example is the climate bonus. I included it because I see that this is discussed a lot in the media in Germany. Climate money, as it is called in Germany, but it is the same basic idea behind it. And I think we have a real success story here. In October 2022, we introduced a CO2 pricing late, but it was absolutely necessary. Again, a measure which exceeds everything that previous governments only promised but didn't put into practice. We did. With this carbon pricing, we always said what is important is we do not want to get more revenue as a government. No, we want to promote really a climate-friendly behavior. And on the one hand, we have an increasing price path similar to CO2 pricing, and the climate bonus is increasing as well. And the climate bonus is a per capita payment to everybody in Austria. The only condition is that in the entitlement year, you must have your main residence in Austria, independent of how old you are, independent of what you're doing, what kind of work you do, whether you are born in Germany or whether you have the Austrian nationality. And this has a progressive effect because with increased income, higher CO2 emissions, I said that earlier, and a per capita climate bonus means that those who have a lower income, households with a lower incomes, who emit less CO2, they get more from that climate bonus. And they also pay less on the side of the carbon price. And our calculations show that this climate bonus in Austria is at least higher than the average charge because of the pricing. So we have a social element and we have a climate element introduced. Socio-ecological policy can work like that. And I'm very happy that we managed that. And by the way, because I know this is a discussion in Germany, 1.2 million euros for climate bonuses we remit per day. So this is possible. And the third example, and then I come to a close, this is our measurement concerning the heating system exchange. This has become very politically charged, and there are those who no longer want to wage a cultural battle on other topics, but with heat pumps. And that was also one of the reasoning behind it, why we said our subsidy system must really be a socially just one, and we have adapted it again and again. But one program which I would like to filter out is clean heating for all. We have decided in Germany in Austria to use two pillars. First, the prohibition of built-in fossil fuel heating in new buildings, and for the existing buildings, we want to promote new systems, and we have a social component. If the income is in the lowest 30% of the income pyramid, 100% of the new heating system will be financed. Heating exchange must not be a question of social division, must not be a question of individual income, but something where we make sure that the people can really join in and therefore get subsidy depending on the different technology use. In the discussion, we can talk about it further. Of course, there are a lot of questions as far as these heating system exchanges are concerned. For example, if you have apartment blocks, etc. But we add all the learnings into the program from Clean Heating for All, because it is important to reach everybody. Now I have to really come to an end, otherwise I talk too much. These were 3 examples of all the measures we put into place in Austria and how we try to combine climate protection with a social component, and not only to look at it like that, but to really implement it like that. And it is clear social acceptance for climate protection, if we want to do that together, this transformation, this is only possible if we do not leave anybody behind, if we have just changes we put into place. Of course, you cannot implement that one-to-one in all the other EU member states. We all have different national conditions. We all have different challenges we are facing, but we have one and the same target. And the instruments we have, regulation, tax laws, etc., we can support the inhabitants by advising them and to make them sensitive for what is necessary. And I'm convinced with this Fit for 55 package and the Green Deal, we really have achieved a historic change. Of course, we have not reached our goal yet, but we will keep fighting for it. And the social component must be much more in the center of the Green Deal too. We do not only need a Green Deal, we also need a social deal. And that was it all from me. Thank you very much, Leonore. We already have a lot of questions coming in, and it was really great to hear what you have been doing. You have already built the bridge to Katrin. She is the member of parliament for the Greens. She was one of the negotiators of the Social Climate Fund, and she will now talk a little bit more about the European level, and she will tell us more about what was done there on that level. Hello, Katrin, you have the floor. Thank you very much. I say hello from San Sebastian. I participate at the Social Economic Conference here, and for 2 days we talk about sustainable businesses. How can we do that? These are interesting and very exciting debates. Thank you very much for opening the slides for me and for showing the three important blocks. I would like to start here. The Green Deal started and was an idea of representatives of the Greens, and President von der Leyen has now put it on the table as a proposal. This was always the Green Deal, but the social deal was quite far away. And then we fought very hard for that we do not only have the environmental component and the climate component included, but that we also include the social committee, that is involved. And that was not a matter of course. Social questions, yeah, they always say, "Ooh, this is not leading. This is very difficult. This is relevant, and the EU member states do not have an influence, but we need to make sure that we have an influence." And very quickly, we had a tandem, Sarah Mathieu, my colleague from Belgium, and me. We started. But the debate was, and that's what I always said, what are we actually talking about? We keep talking about social justice. We talk about social fairness and justice, but what does that mean? Who is our target group? And what was important for us was people living in poverty, in really bad buildings, like in Budapest, for example, in these big flat buildings, or this is Marseille, but this is also the situation in the rural areas, for example, grandma in the little room. And everybody who has a house does not mean that they are rich or that they have a lot of real estate. And that was not clear for a very long time. And here on the group level, the Social Climate Fund, on the level of the Greens, this was important for us because we want to get people out of poverty. And this is also what this fund says. If we talk about mobility poverty, but also about building poverty, we want that Europe, the Commission, the Parliament, makes clear we want to provide money from the ETS2 means, these certificates.
We then want to use the proceeds to give these to the member states, to then also say, dear member states, you're now getting these funds, please invest these into your emission-free buses or into building renovation. And at the end of the day, that was the decision. And of course, it is an old debate, which is, do you invest into structures or do you give people the money directly? And here we said, okay, we are going to invest a part of it into the structures. So Brussels is going to send money to the member states to allow them to put it into mobility and buildings, but we also want people to obtain something directly. And who knows who earned what? Who knows most? Well, for us as Greens, what matters are social partnerships. When these national action plans come about, we want to ensure that we consider people living in poverty and that they also exactly know what can be done with these funds. And that was a novelty. It needs to be clear, with the Social Climate Fund in the European Union, for the very first time in our history, we have a new basket which is not only there to mitigate the climate consequences. We're speaking about consequences, by the way, no longer about stopping climate change. But in this case, it's also all about how we can invest money considering social and climate consequence mitigation for the first time. The Commission made good social policy proposals, 2007 and 2008, and I would have never thought that we'd build up debt in order to mitigate social political consequences. When we had the big financial crisis, the motto was always to save, save, save. And if a country cannot afford something, it simply has to save, and then it will work out. There were all these accusations. The Greeks were put under pressure. There was that image of the lazy Greek that doesn't want to work. But at the end of the day, that leads to all kinds of issues, also when it comes to the democratic structures, and the pain was very deeply felt, especially in the southern European states. And here the question was, what do we need? And of course, here the Climate Social Fund is one thing, but also the Just Transition Fund. How do we support member states? We see it here, around 55 billion euros during the period 2021 to 2027. So how can we support countries like Poland who want to phase out of coal and create new jobs and fields of business activity? And the previous speaker, the minister, said this correctly. There isn't the one and only solution. The Social Climate Fund is going to come into force in 2027. Not all that much money is in it, even though money matters at the end of the day. And that is something we deplore. You could see here, 65 billion from the EU budget, 25% co-financing by the member states. And it is only going to come into force in 26, 27. And here, the climate social plans from the member states are very important. And all of it is to be communicated in the social committee too. As a parliament, we want to, of course, know exactly what the state of affairs is. As the Greens, Michael Bloss and myself, everyone that deals with the topic, and it feels like it was half the party that worked on the Green Deal, all of us did our utmost to push the so-called climate money, the Klimageld. And as was already mentioned, this is really a great facility. And the key word, what is Europe doing for me in a democracy? It always feels a bit like a spaceship. Something is being decided. I don't notice it for 3 to 4 years, and then a law happens. But we did our utmost to ensure that this climate money, for example, when we speak about families, mom, and 3 children, then we have 5 persons that are to benefit from this climate money. And here we're indeed already speaking about a fairly large sum. Of course, if I obtain benefits, the right calculations need to ensue. It cannot be deducted from it. because otherwise people will once again be bitter and say, you aren't doing anything for me. I consider this action to be extremely important, and this hasn't quite found its way through, but it's important to now stay on the ball. It's part of the Green Deal, and I'm nearing the end. We have to ask ourselves a question how social Europe is. We have a number of laws that we introduced. We have the minimum wage. We have the social justice fund. And we're now speaking quite concretely about a European basic security to ensure that nobody lives beyond or below the poverty threshold. Of course, to combat poverty, we need to stay on it. We need to have a deep breath, but I'm very optimistic, and this is certainly something we're going to fight for over the next years, and we're going to have to see whether the demands are being fulfilled, such as the inclusion of the social partners in the framework of the National Climate Plan. We need to ensure that this actually happens and that this also finds its way into the Climate and Social Committee at ours. That would have been my statement, and I now look forward to your questions. Thank you, dear Katrin, for this overview as to what is currently happening at a European level, or what hasn't happened yet as well. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to one of these partners, Ben Lennon. He's a climate and energy expert for the European Trade Union Confederation, the ETUC.
Ben, very glad to have you, and we're looking forward to your little input.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so a bit like Katrin, I focus on the European level because that's where we work. At the ETUC, we represent 45 million workers across Europe, and we work very closely with our German and Austrian partners. I think I'm going to focus on the financial aspect that has been raised a bit and kind of talk about what we need to change and what's good. As outlined already, it's difficult to overstate how great the European Green Deal was, and a really important first step in addressing the huge challenge we face. We really welcome the emphasis on the social aspects that Katrin and her Green colleagues championed. I think it's difficult to overemphasize how much of a change that is on a European level, but we do need to do more. And we often see this as kind of like a great starting point, but where do we need to go? At the launch of the European Green Deal in 2019, von der Leyen said that this was Europe's man on the moon moment. And we would say, do we think we're up to the challenge? Do we think we're spending enough to get ourselves to the moon, or whatever that means? Because it's going to cost a lot to actually meet the challenges we have. At the moment, the European fiscal rules are actually under discussion, and the possible current proposals for a new enforcement tool and a common fiscal framework, if they are implemented very strictly, risks to be driven by austerity and sanctions with little room for social or climate investments, or a combination of the two. And this I think is a point that's not often fully understood as widely as it should be, but under the current fiscal rules, only 4 countries in the EU would be able to spend enough, have enough fiscal space to practically undertake a 1.5-degree Paris line scenario within the debt and deficit limits. So those countries are Ireland, Sweden, Latvia, and Denmark, which together make up only 10% of EU GDP. And why this matters for climate issues really is that on average across EU states, about 80% of climate laws are driven from decisions at a EU level. And I think if we don't act on this, we don't make this change, we're going to face 2 kind of really, really big, what could be disasters really. I'm reluctant to overstate the problem, but we have the kind of environmental disaster and also the political disaster that will follow possibly as a result. So slow inaction for so long has kind of left Europe with a very tight time frame to transform our economy and to fit within the planetary boundaries we know we have to. And if the current fiscal rules are continued or not expanded enough, they'll prevent the public investment at the scale we need, and our goals will not be met. The European Commission itself estimates that to implement the European Green Deal and make the transition to renewable energy, there's actually an annual funding shortfall of 620 billion euro. So, I mean, the Commission itself admits we need to do more, but unfortunately, I think, you know, as has always been the case, at the EU level, finance comes first and tight deficit spending. And, you know, of course, private finance has a very important role to play, but not all private finance exists to make a profit. And not everything that needs to be done actually will generate big enough profit at the scale that private enterprise needs to make a business case. So we need massive public investments too. For the planet, we can't return to austerity measures, and for the people within Europe, we can't do that again either. And to be quite frank about this, like further cuts in public spending without initiatives possibly to tax wealth across all EU countries, while wealth inequality is growing, as a result of the pandemic and the rise in fossil fuel prices after the war in Ukraine, this could lead to, you know, increasing kind of what's often called the cost of living crisis being embedded long term. And with the elections in Europe coming up, you know, at an EU level and in many key member states, this could fuel rejection of mainstream political parties. And it could indeed be the perfect recipe for more and more votes based on kind of nationalistic, racist, or, you know, non-progressive approaches. So I think we need to act together for social justice, climate, and the environment, as well as peace and human rights in Europe and around the world. And that's what, you know, I think to do this actually requires spending. I think, you know, obviously I'm here on behalf of a trade union. We always say we need to spend more money for social things, but the money we're talking about, it's kind of like when you choose to spend it. This money is going to be spent either way. It's much easier to be proactive to address a problem rather than reactive. If we take the example of the energy costs that came as a result of the war in Ukraine. So before the war, on average, European states spent about 3% of their GDP on energy. Now, after the war, that went up to 12% for some countries. Would that have happened if we had built the renewables we should have built? I don't think so. And this is largely done by governments doing deficit spending, where we gave more than 800 billion euro in government subsidies in 1 year, primarily to fossil fuel companies. The money is there. It's just when you choose to spend it that makes a difference. And this kind of reiterates the point of being kind of proactive rather than reactive. As we've heard from Austria just there in the first speech, excuse me, there's lots of great ideas that can be done. Like a €3 a day ticket is really important. It's much cheaper to spend money on public transport collectively than as individuals on cars and roads. And it's a great idea, but all states need to be able to do that spending on public transport and for kind of every aspect of our lives that is heavily entwined with the climate challenge we face. So I think in some ways, you know, trade unions across Europe, in Austria and Germany and everywhere else have really, really good climate policies. The ETUC has really good climate policies. In many ways, the EU has really good climate policies. But if we don't have the public funding there to support it and to back it and to make it possible to expand, to actually meet the challenge we face, both in terms of the social questions we face and the environmental questions we face, then to a certain extent, all these plans, policies, ideas that we work on every day are somewhat just going to be kind of left sitting on a shelf, gathering dust as temperatures continue to rise around us. And we are still producing too much CO2 globally. You know, Europe is doing impressive work relatively to get our numbers down. But if we want European workers as well as citizens across the globe to be able to continue to go to work as is, we need to act more decisively. It's a global problem and we need to respond as such. We need to address this at a European level, also at a UN level, at a COP level. And as Europe, we have a historic responsibility for excessive emissions. And quite simply, on a European level, we need to spend more to address this challenge. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Ben. Da noch mal mit
Thank you very much, Ben. What you said was very important. The costs are created regardless. Either you pay in advance and avoid the damages, or you have to pay for the damages afterwards. That is certainly an important point that we'll talk about more in detail. Now, Svenja Appuhn has the floor. She's a newly elected co-speaker of the Green Youth, the youth organization of the Green Party in Germany. In Germany, the Green Youth has very different positions and focus areas as opposed to the mother party. That is the case for many political groups. And now I very much look forward to finding out what Svenja has to say. We look forward to your intervention. Thank you very much, Max. I too am very, very pleased to be here. Allow me to first of all speak about what the state of affairs is and where we want to go. And then I'm also going to speak about what the climate movement is doing and what our role is at the Green Youth. Perhaps a few words about the current state of affairs of the climate policy. It has to be said bluntly, at a European and at a German level when it comes to the goals, but also when it comes to the measures, we are far away from achieving that 1.5 degrees goal. That goes for the Green Deal, where climate neutrality has arrived too late, but it also goes for the climate protection law. One of the other might have noticed where the FDP is doing its utmost to further water this down by getting rid of the sector goals so that Christian Lindner doesn't have to do anything when it comes to the transport transition. But at the same time, we know that 80% of the people in the European Union are already stating now that they can feel the effects of climate change in their daily lives. And 80% of the people have also stated that we are steering towards a global catastrophe if we do not reduce our consumption of resources. And the catastrophes that we're speaking about can be seen every year. I remember these terrible images from Pakistan last year. A third of the country was underwater. Imagine the dimension of this. Millions of people lost their home. Islands are going down. We have had the terrible catastrophes this year in Slovenia as well as in Libya. The climate crisis is escalating day by day. At the same time, when you look at surveys, the topic of climate seems to be losing in importance, even though the climate crisis is becoming worse. And we also realize that the majorities for climate protection seem to be eroding. And that even threatens the achievements we've already had. And now this begs the question, how can this be? In light of the huge discrepancy, and this has already been mentioned, we're still experiencing a huge cost of living crisis all over the European Union. So the reality is that a whole lot of people are struggling. Real wages are going down. They haven't gone up for a long, long time now in Germany, and they certainly aren't developing on par with productivity gains. We are indeed experiencing the middle classes struggling more and more. And there are a lot of existential fears as well that can be felt all over. Allow me to briefly state how the situation is for young people, because I sometimes wonder if this is clear. Young people are doing extremely poorly at the moment. At first we had Corona, then we had the cost of living crisis. There are studies that show that 1/3 of young people in Germany are depressed. More than half of all young people would rather live in the past than in the future.
Es war immer die Annahme, es wird besser. Es gab ein Wohlstandsversprechen, dass die
There was always the idea that it will get better. There was this promise it will get better for the next generation. And this is not applicable anymore to our generation. And we are really a generation that has gone from crisis to crisis. This is the situation for the young people. But this social crisis, as I said, is really reaching out within society. We have the situation we really need now climate protection in order to make sure that we still live here on that planet in the future. And at the same time, we have a problematic policy for many people. And the only answer is we have to have now a policy which really improves the life of the people now. And I have a few suggestions. Housing policy, for example, which makes sure that the rents go down and that the facades are being insulated. But then you have to deal with the property situation on the real estate market. If you look at Berlin, for example, there was a referendum about the expropriation of the big housing companies, and the Senate did not put it into place. Now they would like to have a second referendum, but by bundling that and saying, okay, we are renovating the houses and the rents go down, then we can do something. If we think of the energy transition, this really has to be combined with the democratization of the energy systems. And we do not want to have monopolies. If we look at energy, solar energy and wind turbines, there is a lot of potential here, and this must be in the hands of the municipalities, in the hands of the communities. The target must be really that companies, energy companies who made a lot of money with their dirty energy, really use the money in order to change something in a democratic way. And then if we look at the industrial change, what we see now in terms of the move towards the right wing is that the people have the impression they cannot really decide about their life anymore. And this is also what researchers say. It is this idea of taking back control. This is what Trump promoted, that this is really the way out to control the own life. But you could do that differently by implementing a transformation in such a way that those in an industry that needs to change decide how to produce differently. An example, in Florence, for example, there's still a company. This was a former supplier of the automotive industry. It was supposed to be closed down, and then they occupied the company, and they said, well, what we have here, the employees, we could also build wind turbines and other energy resources. And now there is a big crowdfunding going on. So to democratize production and decide themselves how to do this, there are a lot of good ideas available, how you can really do that. Extend buses and the rail transport. You need both, actually. A very extensive public transport system. The €9 ticket, for example, in Germany will become probably even more expensive. It already got more expensive because the government cannot make sure to subsidize it properly. And at the same time, of course, we need better working conditions for the employees. And I get a little sign here that I come to an end. And I really think a lot have to be done. We have to think about the debt regulations in the European Union. They are arbitrary. They need to be abolished. On the one hand, we have people who travel around the world in their private jet and the super yachts, for example. You can even get an exemption from the CO2 tax. Somebody explained to me recently. But also, as far as the costs are concerned, the question of redistribution has to be answered. We need really billions of investment, and it's not clear, of course, who's going to pay that. But I'm sure the extension of the grids, for example, if this is only to be paid by the community, this will not meet with approval. And now a question, what are we doing as a climate movement? Because they seem to be a bit in a cul-de-sac at the moment. More and more people say they do not have the impression that they can be part of this climate movement. And this one initiative, which gives me an awful lot of hope, is the project We Drive Together. This is a joint initiative with Fridays of Future to build a joint movement. And the collective bargaining agreements next year will also be influenced, and to go on strike together and to say, we the climate activists and the employees, we go on strike together until the working conditions are substantially improved, because otherwise there will be not enough people, and there needs to be money provided in order to extend the bus transport and the rail transport. 16 billion is the target additionally. And at the moment, we have more than 50 local groups where we build up joint groups between employees of public transport companies and representatives of the climate movement. Please stay tuned. A lot is going to happen on our social media, etc. Great. Thank you very much indeed. You included a number of aspects which also come back into our questions coming in from Slido. And now we do something unusual. We now include science. And Professor Kalkuhl, you can now present us the fact check. No, this is not how we're going to do it. You can give us an overview. Professor Kalkuhl is head of the working group for economic growth at the Faculty of Economic and Social Science at the University of Potsdam. You have the floor. Thank you very much for your invitation and for the great debate here. Maybe a little bit more about myself. I was one of the advisors of the German government when the carbon pricing was introduced, and we talked a lot about the social implications and the climate money. And we also suggested that that was not put into place by the government, but that is something which we really supported. We said we need such a climate money in order to have a socially just climate policy. What is our position? What are the developments as far as the climate money is concerned? And I would like to start with a picture which some of you might know. This is from the Economic Wise, who show that such a climate money in connection with the CO2 pricing is a redistribution from the rich to the poor, because the CO2 footprint is higher of the rich people. And this is one perspective onto the climate money. This is what connects it with the redistribution. But there's a big distribution, as you can see here. These are the household data for Germany, about 50,000 households. What you see here, and this is a second perspective, is a scattering, an enormous scattering. So climate policy as a negative lottery. Those who have good insulation, for example, who have district heating, pay almost nothing. And those who live in old houses with oil heating, they pay a lot. And for them, the climate money is not enough. We know that we need much higher CO2 prices, about 200 to 300 euros in the next years. And this leads to a real imbalance. And the previous speaker mentioned it already. A lot of people are uncertain. They are afraid. And this does not only apply to those who do not have enough money, but also those who own buildings, for example. They are faced with a loss of value. Those buildings which are not insulated, they lose in value 20%, for example. And gas, this is also something which means that people get upset about it, because they see that their pension is going away, and they have no idea how they will be able to afford all that. And that leads us to the question, how should that climate money look like? First of all, something that is a flat rate and per capita with a redistribution from rich to poor. We can also say we make it dependent on the income. Those who are rich do not get anything anymore. Then you have an even stronger redistribution. Then you have to check the income. This is not so easy in practice. And the third way is climate money depending on the burden. And of course, you must not really look at and pay the entire price. it has to be differentiated. And there are certain examples. For example, in Austria, they have a regional differentiation they introduced, and they give access to public transport, and this depends also on the availability of public transport in regional where there is not so much public transport available. And you could also think about using that for buildings, for example. And this could also be done in the transport sector. The commuter allowance, for example, was also adapted for those who have to go a longer way to work, get a bigger support. What does that mean? We do not have a redistribution from poor to old, from rich to poor. No, this is not happening. What we support is this negative lottery, and that needs to be reduced. And I think this is something we think a lot about, we as scientists. How can that be done in a clever way so that it's practical and easy, and at the same time keeps the incentive effect of this carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is only one part of it, part of the cost, and I think this is also very helpful to think about which costs are part of this transformation. They are quite high, and for some they are too high, but carbon pricing is only part of it. We call that now carbon inventory costs because this depends on the building. I have a house with a certain insulation, with a certain heating, and I cannot do anything in the short term, but I have to pay these costs. And therefore, these need to get a compensation depending on the costs they have. But when they change, we need to keep these incentives. We need a climate money which really compensates and pays this money back we get from car pricing, so that this block is more heterogeneous. And then there are, of course, other costs, additional costs. We have to invest. We have to invest in heat pumps. We have to invest in district heating, in electric vehicles, etc. These are additional costs. Sometimes there are other additional costs. If the buildings are not insulated very well, then you have high electricity costs, for example. And these additional costs, this is something that needs to be dealt with via support programs. They should cover this block and this very unequal cost factor. Some really need only a heat pump. Others also have to integrate other heating possibilities and systems. This financing cannot be financed only via carbon pricing, because if it does that, this block here will be increased. It has to come from the national budgets, and I think this is a problem we have in Germany very often, because these programs come very often from the Climate Transformation Fund, which are financed by the CO2 pricing. And this is a problem for a just implementation, because then there's no money left for climate money. Apart from how you really put it into practice, it's not there anymore because you've used it all for the support programs. This means we have to face the question, how are we going to finance all that? How are we going to do that? And I think, therefore, it is important to tell the inhabitants what we win from all that. We have to deal with climate damages as well. And I made a short calculation. For the Green Deal, you can quantify it. If you look at the climate damages from each ton of CO2, this is very conservative, only based on published scientific studies, doesn't include quite a number of damages. But if you do that, 140 to 400 billion euros of climate damage are saved. This is quite a high number of damages we do not have. This means we have lower food prices. We have not as many conflicts as we have now. And this is something we have to tell the people. And this is also what they get when they finance these support programs. And the geopolitical dimension is also very important and often underestimated. because of the Green Deal, our oil and gas prices will be reduced by 4%. This doesn't sound very dramatic, but that is only what is true for the EU. For Russia, means a loss of about 23 million per year. This is not gigantic, but you have to think about it. Every euro that is put into the Russian military produces a lot of damage for Ukraine, for Europe. This means counter armament, this means support delivery. So all in all, this is a lot of money, and this can be avoided. Well, to come to an end, the Social Climate Fund and the ETS2. I think this is really one of the best hours of the European climate policy. There are quite a number of insecurities, uncertainties, because the EU Commission gives a lot of possibilities to put it into place. And that is a problem because a lot of people do not know what that will mean for them. They do not know how high the CO2 pricing will be, and we do not know what do we have to think about. Is it really only 50 euros or will it be maybe 300 euros? And that is a huge difference. Secondly, climate money, a lot of people support that. But if you look into the legal text of the ETS2, it says that the revenues can only be used for schemes with a proven positive environmental impact. And that is a problem because it is meant to be a compensation for the CO2 pricing. And the CO2 pricing is creating the effect, climate effect, not the climate money. And I think this is a bit too much we put into it. This makes it very complicated and not very practical. And the Social Climate Fund, the big advantage is it means really a redistribution from rich to poor. The way it is designed, this is very good. But again, the expenses are capped at about 70 euros per ton. And this is something that needs to be rethought. And these transfers are only limited. Quite a high amount is supposed to be used for investments, and they should be rather financed via tax money, I think. And this is the end of my presentation. I think that was enough. I do not have much more time, and I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. That was great. And now we have half an hour time for a discussion. I think we could use this time only for questions concerning the climate bonus, Leonore Gewessler, but then it's a bit one-sided. And this is also a bit what Matthias Kalkuhl just said. There are very different ways, or at least 3 different ways, how this can be done. Leonore, could you maybe say a little bit more? There are many questions about the payment frequency, the amount, and I read about a regional differentiation. Maybe you can include a few details. Somebody who is not living in Austria and somebody who says, yeah, I have a little flat in Innsbruck. How is that going to happen?
Thank you very much. As I mentioned in the presentation, the climate bonus was originally foreseen as the same bonus for everyone over 18. Everyone above 18 gets 100%, under 18, 50%. In the coalition discussions, we tried to do exactly what Professor Kalkuhl has suggested, and that is to react more to how people are affected. That is why, together with Statistics Austria, we divided the federal area into clusters We took a look at the availability of infrastructure, how far is the way to schools, to kindergartens, etc. So basically, how can I take care of my daily life? And then we would have a regional differentiation on that basis. So wherever, for example, there's less public transport, where the structures are poorer, the climate bonus tends to be higher. That is the variant that we can take care of administratively as well, because of course for it we used registration data. So there are some inherent imprecisions. As for the amount, we have 110 euros in Austria. So everyone above the age of 18, like I said, the only eligibility criteria is registered in Austria for 183 days a year. So affected by CO2 prices. The base rate that everyone gets is 110 euros. And then there are 3 levels above it, 150, 185, or 220 euro. 220 euros per head is the maximum amount per year. That is significantly more than the average burden by the CO2 prices. If you take a look at the average in Austria, we're currently at around 127 euros. So the climate bonus generally overcompensates, of course, with a certain distribution. The payout ensues once a year on 2 days, so to speak, in autumn for everyone that lived stably in Austria during the first half, and then in the first quarter of the next year for all of those that moved in the year before. Hence meaning that the main economic center of activity wasn't determinable yet. Apologies. It was probably the biggest digitalization project ever by the Austrian administration. Within 1 year, we built up the whole infrastructure required for this because indeed, there's no other payment that is being sent to every person in that country. It's the first and the only one. But in the negotiations, it was extremely important for me. Acceptance means that we cannot exclude anyone only because we have difficulties when it comes to the transaction, when it comes to reaching them, or when it comes to the data, which is why we intensively dealt on ensuring that we can really access all of the required data. Of course, it's complicated because they're different data sources. How can we also ensure that we protect data? And how can we transfer as much as possible directly? We have had transactions of around 8 million euros. Majority is directly sent to the accounts, or when people do not have bank accounts, or when people didn't tell us their account number, a voucher is being sent to them. So a lot of effort went into the system, but it does work very well indeed. And it is also one of the climate political measures that everyone knows in Austria. Okay, great. Have a sip of water. Let me get the other ones on board now, because we've had a few really good questions. Perhaps we could start with the questions relating to the climate money. I'd like to ask Katrin Langensiepen and Ben Lennon to join in when it comes to the question climate money at a European level, or other support programs such as for exchanging your heating. How do you see this? What are the trade unions and the Greens demanding when it comes to the question, do we need one European climate money that is being paid by Brussels? Or are we going to be speaking about 27 national climate monies, as well as other measures? How can this be coordinated? I heard something about social plans. But the people who have registered here are repeatedly asking how this would be organized at a European level. Perhaps we could start with Katrin, followed by Ben. Well, that would be revolutionary if we sent the money directly from Brussels to the people. And we from the Greens would like for exactly that to happen. We have two opponents. Not every member state in the European Union is transparent. I could be speaking about Orban, for example, or other member states that simply do not have an interest in money coming from Brussels circumventing them. They'd rather use it for themselves, to put it this way. But our green demand is that the climate money goes to the people. Because the people are asking, what is the parliament, what is Brussels doing for us? That would lead to more acceptance for European policies. It then wouldn't be this bigger spacecraft where people ask, what are they doing for us? No, it would concretely mean that for my CO2 consumption, I'm getting the sum X per capita in my family. For example, when you have a four-headed household, you would get that climate money for 4 persons. That's the ideal state of affairs. But I'd also like to mention that there are, of course, on the one hand, states that don't want the money to circumvent them. But we also hear what is going to happen with that money afterwards. Of course, we're not going to solve all climate issues with it, but it does mean that we clearly stress that if you can save CO2, you're going to get a subsidy, a reimbursement for whatever you have spent. We are far away from saying that we're going to solve all poverty issues with that. We're definitely not stating that that is the only solution. I think we were quite explicit in this, but it would be a very big step into making Brussels more visible, into making European policies more visible when it comes to where the money goes and how I can benefit from the European Union as a citizen. As for the data, well, it exists. The people are registered somewhere whenever they step foot on EU soil. So here too, things can be made possible. So that must be our demand. And that would be a big social, political, democratic step into the right direction from the viewpoint of the Greens. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, I agree kind of strongly with a lot of what Katrin just said there in relation to the question. Maybe to give the specifics of the European trade union perspective. So we kind of represent 93 trade unions across Europe, and every 4 years we meet to make an action plan for the next 4 years. And this May we met in Berlin and kind of unanimously decided on precisely what the trade unions want in terms of finance. And the main thing is to kind of terminate the European Fiscal Compact and to reform the Stability and Growth Pact into a new, what we call a Solidarity and Growth Pact, which commits governments and EU institutions to engage with investments, both for quality job creation, with social objectives and conditionalities on the same level of the fiscal and economic targets we currently have. So we are asking kind of to change what the purpose of the EU is in some ways. You know, as I said before, it's first and foremost a financial agreement. Then kind of trade comes second, and then we like to try and add on a few other bits. But we like to kind of imagine what it would be like if we had climate and social objectives at the core. And yeah, I think we would also want kind of a new fiscal framework where member states have kind of fiscal targets that are country specific. And like new public investment would be debt financed. That's, prioritized for European social and green agenda aims, really. And yeah, finally, we want to enlarge the European Central Bank mandate to include full and quality employment and to support green measures on an equal footing again. Thank you.
Danke dir. Das ist glaube ich, eine sehr, sehr gute Überleitung.
Thank you.
Zu vielen weiteren Fragen, die wir bekommen haben.
And that is a good bridge to the other questions we've received, especially when it comes to funding climate money, but also when it comes to funding transformative measures. Annette, for example, asked how the climate money is going to be introduced if the money already seems to be earmarked That is something that Matthias Kalkuhl also already said. So I'd like to ask Svenja Appuhn as well as Leonore Gewessler. There's a question of expenditure priorities. There seem to be big differences between Austria and Germany here, and there's certainly differences in other countries too. So perhaps Matthias Kalkuhl could also say something about this. But the question is, how can we ensure that sufficient money is made available for this climate money, for this type of reimbursement, and how much is required? We heard it from Austria. Is it enough from the viewpoint of the scientific community? Is it enough? And how is the whole thing going to be funded? Also against the background of all of the other expenses you have, perhaps Svenja, followed by Leonore, and then Matthias. I wrote into the chat that perhaps Christian Lindner should take a class organized by Leonore Gewessler. But of course, it is a question of political priorities. One did also manage to water down a law about the end of the combustion engine, so things are possible. But of course, all of this is linked to the fact that the expenses are earmarked for other areas. I think the problem could be simply solved if we wouldn't stick to our current policies. We could create and finance our own debt programs. This could also be funded if we dare to introduce a wealth tax. But it makes perhaps more sense to use money for the running costs in social areas, but this is up to others to judge. Either way, there would be political ways to fully pay out the climate money from the income of the CO2 price and to indeed conduct all of these investments. It's a political question, so it's all about political struggles here, which is why it begs the question, what can be done at a political level? And I do think that the climate movement has to consider such aspects, because without money, there won't be any climate protection. Thank you. Perhaps Leonore could say something about this. How did you deal with this in Austria? How do you pay for all the rest when you have to pay out the climate money? Indeed, we did both. The CO2 price is find its way into the climate bonus as a compensation and as a progressive relief. In parallel, we have our environmental budget, which is available for exchanging your heaters, for expanding renewables, for more circular economy. And we 12x'd, or we increased the funds by 12x. And I don't know enough about the German specificities, but we operate in an area of sustainable budget policy that ensures that we invest now and do not have to buy emission certificates or pay damages afterwards. After 3 years of serious climate policy in Austria, it is clear that we still have a long way ahead of us. But indeed, the emissions are going down in reality, not only in the forecasts. And that means that there will be fewer costs for future generations. We are avoiding costs from occurring in the past. We're basically front-loading when it comes to investments. As for the volumes, the climate bonus has a budget of around 1.2 billion euros. Of course, Germany has 10 times as many inhabitants. If you wanted to compare sums, you'd have to increase it by 10. But allow me to point to one other thing. There is the question of how, in the EU, in general, we deal with our fiscal rules. And this is a question that is intensively being debated and discussed in our coalition too. Ben Lennon alluded to it. Within the government, we do represent different positions. What was always important to us, and that's also how we phrased it in our government program. On the one hand, we want to ensure that climate protection It's not a question of whether you can afford it on the one hand, and on the other hand, we want to ensure that through the debt rules, it doesn't lead to climate political investments no longer being made. And we're not at the end yet when it comes to what the Commission has proposed. There's still a lot to do here. And the question of room for maneuvering is, of course, decided at a national level when it comes to setting priorities, and the Greens fought for this intensively. We need the budgets, but of course, it's also decided at a European level when it comes to our room for maneuvering. It is certainly going to be one of the biggest battles, one of the biggest topics in the European elections too. How we're going to deal with this fiscally in the future. And what Ben said about the central bank, I found also very interesting. In the German-speaking countries, this is a topic that is perhaps discussed a bit less. We have a somewhat conservative opinion as to central banks, but in other countries such as France, there is this discussion as to what a central bank can do and what a European central bank should do. It's a very, very interesting topic. I do not think we have the time to discuss this at length now, but it is an area of itself that we could discuss the role of the central banks. I'd like to ask Matthias Kalkuhl to respond to the question relating to the amount, and then perhaps another question, which was also posed on Slido. There are 3 models, and Austria tested 2 of them. But now, ETS2, 2027. We're no longer in the testing phase anymore. If you were to say, or if you were to design a European climate money, how would you do it at a European level under the assumption that we do not have another 2 years to conduct studies? Because, of course, we need to get into the implementation. How is it going to work? I'm grateful that I'm not a politician when I hear such questions. If you had to do something very quickly, then I'd do climate money per capita, because it seems to be the most simple thing that you can quickly and effectively implement. But if you aren't well prepared, then you cannot allow for high CO2 prices. I am a friend of high CO2 prices, but I think that it can only be done together with a well-functioning social balancing mechanism, which needs to be well pondered over. As long as it doesn't exist, CO2 prices above 100 or 200 euros should not be made possible. It is both related to each other. We have these maximum price rules, 45 euros in ETS2, and you simply need to take 2 more years until you've worked on this. I think all efforts need to be undertaken to achieve this now. That would be my response to this question. The per capita climate money is better than nothing, but it's not precise enough. And even with it, prices that are so high, that's extremely explosive. Now, as for the funding and what amounts are required, we only have rough estimates for the building sector. I think it is fair to speak of around what we spend for the Bundeswehr. So 200 billion euro, I think, is what was foreseen as extraordinary funding for the Bundeswehr, the German armed forces. This needs to be made available. Now, there's 3 options for this. We could cut the state budget, but you only make enemies by doing that. Then you have the possibility to increase taxes. That can be done, especially when it comes to the higher earners. And then we already spoke about debts. I think that is something that we have to discuss. We need to make the debt break a tad more intelligently. in Germany. Of course, debt is a burden for future generations. Climate policy is of benefit for future generations, but at the same time, that harms future generations because they're going to have to pay off this debt. And when it comes to all of these debt rules we've had, the issue was that there were a whole lot of loopholes, there were a lot of interpreting as to what is what, and that means that a lot of countries are creating high costs. But for climate policy, it would be easier to have a debt break that is free of any potential abuse. We're working on models and hopefully we'll have something next year.
Dann haben wir jetzt noch 8 Minuten und ich
Okay, that was a good announcement. Now we have 8 minutes left. And I want to include 2 questions from the participants, and that's very important. And Svenja said it, Matthias also touched to it. Klaus asked, rich people increase climate change. How do we want to deal with that? And I combine it. I know these are 2 sides of the same medal, but I think we can combine the discussion. And I would like to give all of our guests still the possibility to say something for 1.5, 2 minutes. I know this is not easy, and then we can finish on time. Klaus says, though the rich people promote climate change, how do we want to deal with it? And how just is the Green Deal towards the nations of the Southern Hemisphere? Is it not only an European focus? And Lucas has another question. And he says it in English. Do you think about climate justice where the industrial countries are responsible for the main emissions? Do you see a compensation for the South as a possible instrument? What could the EU do? First of all, the question of responsibility on the EU level, and then the responsibility towards the global South. And I would like to keep this sequence and start with Katrin, please. Yes, of course. It is a European debate we are having here, first of all. We want to become climate neutral, and this is one component. We do not talk about a complete solution for everything. Debt release for the South, I say yes to that. But the debate, and this is what we can do as well, is the Green Deal as a European deal. And then we can talk about investments in alternative energies on the African continent, but that is a different debate. So I say yes. This is a starting point. This is something we can do as a starting point, and we have to hurry. The resistance is big. We do not have to have any illusions about that. And this is something we really have to do something for. Thank you very much. Ben Lennon, please.
Yeah, so I'll try and kind of maybe look at them both together. If we need to tax wealth, tax rich people. I understand there's a cost of living crisis, and lots of people who we would consider well off are already suffering around Europe. If we actually look at, this has been well known now for a number of years, but from the very famous work of the economist Thomas Piketty, a lot of wealth is actually not just income, but family wealth and other ways where wealth is earned. Like, that is completely under-tapped resource in terms of financing the transition. And if you reduce rich people's spending power and give it to poorer people, those rich people will spend less on destroying the planet. I know this statistic sounds absolutely crazy, but I remember it because it's true. The average US fridge, so the average American's fridge uses more CO2 than the average person in Nigeria. And so, of course, we have a response to the global south. And the European Green Deal is completely focused on Europe. There's some things about kind of procurement, about where we buy these critical raw materials and other essential things from, that look at kind of supply chains, and it's a step in the right direction. It's not enough, but it is good in many ways. And I think yesterday the European Union announced that they're planning on making a substantial financial contribution to what's known as the kind of loss and damage fund that has come out of previous COPs. Is going to be discussed at the end of this month in Dubai as the next COP. It remains to be seen, but it could be a really significant amount of money that will be given to address the challenges of the Global South. It's very much open for debate, but we haven't lost hope yet, and we must continue to push for it.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much indeed. Matthias, Kalkuhl, this is a bit surprising now. Sorry. Yes, I think it is very difficult to avoid that the rich people do not have a bigger CO2 footprint, even with this carbon dioxide pricing. You know, they can still buy then synthetic fuel, for example, for their private jets. With the climate policy, I wouldn't say that we try to deal with social inequality. It mustn't increase social inequality, but we have to look at it separately via income tax, etc. I think globally we are not doing enough in order to use the reduction and to use forests, for example, those who can take up CO2, like moors, for example. This needs to be promoted. And one could do a lot with remarkably low amounts of money in order to bind CO2. And this is not done sufficiently by the EU. We really concentrate on our national emissions. That is correct. But at the same time, we need to check and see that with a certain amount of money, we can reduce CO2 emission in other countries. And the art is then, of course, to get the relevant contracts in order to provide the money when the CO2 is reduced there. And this is quite a challenge for the EU. Leonore Gewessler and then Svenja Appuhn, so that the young generation has the final word. That is, I think, quite appropriate. Leonore, yes, the question, how do we deal with this unequal distribution? I can support what Professor Kalkuhl said. Climate policy must take into consideration social justice, but the distribution of income, etc., must be done via other instruments as well, like the tax policy, for example, and taxes for income, taxes for the wealth you have. And I must say, we do not do ourselves a favor if we put everything onto the climate policy. Then Global South, Global North, this question, and the Green Deal. The Green Deal, of course, is our program. It's our European program to implement the targets from the Paris Convention. Of course, we need other measures as well. Green Deal 2.0 is absolutely necessary because we see, and this is something we will support in the next year as well. We have not reached the goal yet, of course, but no, I say it differently. Of course, it is a European program, but we see other countries do something similar. China, USA, China, for example, from the next year, probably reduced emissions. But we as a countries in the North have a certain responsibility to support the Global South, to make sure that this development is possible in the Global South as well. Financing is a central question in this. And from my work during the last climate conferences, what I learned is to focus on measures which have an impact, which have a fast impact, and to support those measures and not to start with the most controversial topics. The question, the costs for the financing for developing countries, how can that be made easier? And how do we fulfill our promises we have already done with 100 billion and the loss and damage fund? How can that be implemented? Austria has 50 million euros pledged for the loss and damage fund. So this is something we really have to make progress this year in order to get a good result, because At the end, we will only be able to do that together, and everybody has to take his and her own responsibility. And this is also applicable to the global scale. Svenja, you have the last word. Thank you very much. Of course, this puts a high pressure on me. Okay, rich and the rich people and the climate, there are two dimensions. First, luxury consume. And I would say you can talk about legislation. Nobody can tell me it is absolutely necessary to own a yacht and to use a private jet. This is something you can really say this is not allowed anymore. Unnecessary luxury. And this would also be popular, but that is not enough. If you look at the CO2 impact, then the super rich take important investment decisions. And this is what has the influence at the end of the day. And there we need a clear legislation. I would also say it doesn't need to be done only via decarbon pricing, not exclusively, because that leads to social differences. We need an industrial policy with planning, etc. The cost of the transformation, I think I said it often enough. There needs to be a just distribution. Therefore, climate policy is closely linked with distribution, redistribution, global scale. I think we need a lot more for social justice. On the one hand, we have the debt release, then negotiations on the same level. Still a lot of business contracts are signed which misuse the dependency of the South. Unconditional provision of technology to the South. This needs to be done simply to make life easier and better for those living there, to increase their wealth there. And that I would like to add, the European Green Deal really leads to an enormous number of differences, global differences, as far as the raw material provision is concerned. If you see what is happening there, this is really frightening, and we need to find different answers to that. It cannot be that this growth is done at the expense of the global South. System change and not climate change. That's what it is all about. We have to ask this question. We need to change the system. Thank you very much. I think that was a great word at the end. Challenge accepted, mission accomplished, I can say. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all. I thank our 5 guests. I would like to thank our 1,200 participants who joined us. There were a lot of questions. I tried to include quite a number of them. I would like to thank our interpreters who did not have an easy task today. They did a great job. Thank you very much indeed. Please stay with us. At 6 o'clock on Thursday, we have another seminar talking about the Green Deal, but then we will talk about the individual measures, not only about the big framework. So we go into the detail. Now, since the implementation, kindly join us there. You will get the link tomorrow. Thank you very much. All the best. Bye to Europe. See you.